what percent probability would you currently place on the hypothesis that COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
So I maintain a flowchart of all the possible explanations, and it doesn't break down exactly that way. The likelihood that it emerged from a lab is very, very high. If it emerged from a lab, the likelihood that the lab was the Wuhan Institute is very, very high. There are multiple different kinds of evidence that point to the lab, and there is literally no evidence that points to nature. Either the evidence points nowhere or it points to the lab, and the lab could mean any lab, but geographically, obviously, the labs in Wuhan are the most likely, and the lab that was most directly involved with research on viruses that look like COVID, that look like SARS-CoV-2, is obviously the place that one would start. But I would say the likelihood that this virus came from a lab is well above 95%. We can talk about the question of could a virus have been brought into the lab and escaped from there without being modified? That's also possible, but it doesn't explain any of the anomalies in the genome of SARS-CoV-2. Could it have been delivered from another lab? Could Wuhan be a distraction in order that we would connect the dots in the wrong way? That's conceivable. I currently have that below 1% on my flowchart, but I think
a very dark thought that somebody would do that almost as a political attack on China.
Well, it depends. I don't even think that's one possibility. Sometimes when Eric and I talk about these issues, we will generate a scenario just to prove that something could live in that space, right? It's a placeholder for whatever may actually have happened. And so it doesn't have to have been an attack on China. That's certainly one possibility. But I would point out, if you can predict the future in some unusual way, better than others, you can print money, right? That's what markets that allow you to bet for or against virtually any sector allow you to do. So you can imagine a simply amoral person or entity generating a pandemic, attempting to cover their tracks because it would allow them to bet against things like, cruise ships, air travel, whatever it is, and bet in favor of, sanitizing gel and whatever else you would do. So am I saying that I think somebody did that? No, I really don't think it happened. We've seen zero evidence that this was intentionally released. However, were it to have been intentionally released by somebody who did not want it known where it had come from, releasing it in Wuhan would be one way to cover their tracks. So we have to leave the possibility formally open, but acknowledge there's no evidence.
And the probability, therefore, is low. I tend to believe, maybe this is the optimistic nature that I have, that people who are competent enough to do the kind of thing we just described are not going to do that, because it requires a certain kind of, I don't want to use the word evil, but whatever word you want to use to describe the kind of disregard for human life required to do that. You're just, that's just not going to be coupled with competence. I feel like there's a trade-off chart where competence on one axis and evil is on the other. And the more evil you become, the crappier you are at doing great engineering, scientific work required to deliver weapons of different kinds, whether it's bioweapons or nuclear weapons, all those kinds of things. That seems to be the lessons I take from history, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to be happening in the future. But to stick on the lab leak idea, because the flowchart is probably huge here, because there's a lot of fascinating possibilities. One question I want to ask is, what would evidence for natural origins look like? So one piece of evidence for natural origins is that it's happened in the past, that viruses have jumped.
Oh, they do jump.
That's one, that's possible to have happened, so that's a sort of like a historical evidence, okay, well, it's possible that it happened.
It's not evidence of the kind you think it is. It's a justification for a presumption.
Right.
right? So the presumption upon discovering a new virus circulating is certainly that it came from nature, right? The problem is the presumption evaporates in the face of evidence, or at least it logically should.
Right.
And it didn't in this case. It was maintained by people who privately in their emails acknowledged that they had grave doubts about the natural origin of this virus.
Is there some other piece of evidence that we could look for and see that would say, this increases the probability that it's natural origins?
Yeah. In fact, there is evidence. I always worry that somebody is going to make up some evidence in order to reverse the flow.
Oh, boy.
Well, let's say I am.
There's a lot of incentive for that, actually.
There's a huge amount of incentive. On the other hand, why didn't the powers that be, the powers that lied to us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, why didn't they ever fake weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Whatever force it is, I hope that force is here too. And so whatever evidence we find is real.
It's the competence thing I'm talking about. But okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we can get back to that. But I would say, that the giant piece of evidence that will shift the probabilities in the other direction is the discovery of either a human population in which the virus circulated prior to showing up in Wuhan that would explain where the virus learned all of the tricks that it knew instantly upon spreading from Wuhan. So that would do it, or an animal population in which an ancestor epidemic can be found in which the virus learned this before jumping to humans. But I point out in that second case, you would certainly expect to see a great deal of evolution in the early epidemic, which we don't see. So there almost has to be a human population somewhere else that had the virus circulating, or an ancestor of the virus that we first saw in Wuhan circulating. And it has to have gotten very sophisticated in that prior epidemic before hitting Wuhan in order to explain the total lack of evolution and extremely effective virus that emerged at the end of 2019.
So you don't believe in the magic of evolution to spring up with all the tricks already there? Like everybody who doesn't have the tricks, they die quickly. And then you just have this beautiful virus that comes in with a spike protein and the through mutation and selection, like the ones that succeed and succeed big are the ones that are going to just spring into life with the tricks.
Well, no. That's called a hopeful monster, and hopeful monsters don't work. The job of becoming a new pandemic virus is too difficult. It involves two very difficult steps, and they both have to work. One is the ability to infect a person and spread in their tissues sufficient to make an infection, and the other is to jump between individuals at a sufficient rate that it doesn't go extinct for one reason or another. Those are both very difficult jobs. They require, as you describe, selection. And the point is, selection would leave a mark. We would see evidence that it was
in
taking
animals
place.
Or humans. We would see
both, right?
And we would see this evolutionary trace of the virus gathering the tricks up.
Yeah, you would see the virus. You would see the clumsy virus get better and better. And yes, I am a full believer in the power of that process. In fact, I believe it. What I know from studying the process is that it is much more powerful than most people imagine. That what we teach in the Evolution 101 textbook is too clumsy a process to do what we see it doing, and that actually people should increase their expectation of the rapidity with which that process can produce just jaw-dropping adaptations. That said, we just don't see evidence that it happened here, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it means in spite of immense pressure to find it somewhere, there's been no hint, which probably means it took place inside of a laboratory.
So inside the laboratory, gain-of-function research on viruses, and I believe most of that kind of research is doing this exact thing that you're referring to, which is accelerated evolution. And just watching evolution do its thing on a bunch of viruses and seeing what kind of tricks get developed. The other method is engineering viruses. So manually adding on the tricks. Which do you think we should be thinking about here?
So, mind you, I learned what I know in the aftermath of this pandemic emerging. I started studying the question, and I would say, based on the content of the genome and other evidence in publications from the various labs that were involved in generating this technology, a couple of things seem likely. This SARS-CoV-2 does not appear to be entirely the result of either a splicing process or serial passaging. It appears to have both things in its past, or it's at least highly likely that it does. So, for example, the furin cleavage site looks very much like it was added in to the virus, and it was known that that would increase its infectivity in humans and increase its tropism. The virus appears to be excellent at spreading in humans and minks and ferrets. Now, minks and ferrets are very closely related to each other, and ferrets are very likely to have been used in a serial passage experiment, the reason being that they have an ACE2 receptor that looks very much like the human ACE2 receptor. And so were you going to passage the virus or its ancestor through an animal in order to increase its infectivity in humans, which would have been necessary, ferrets would have been very likely. It is also quite likely that humanized mice were utilized, and it is possible that human airway tissue was utilized. I think it is vital that we find out what the protocols were. If this came from the Wuhan Institute, we need to know it, and we need to know what the protocols were exactly, because they will actually give us some tools that would be useful in fighting SARS-CoV-2 and hopefully driving it to extinction, which ought to be our priority. It is a priority that is not apparent from our behavior, but it really is. It should be our objective. If we understood where our interests lie, we would be much more focused on it. But those protocols would tell us a great deal. If it wasn't the Wuhan Institute, we need to know that. If it was nature, we need to know that. And if it was some other laboratory, we need to figure out who, what, and where, so that we can determine what we can determine about what was done.
You're opening up my mind about why we should investigate, why we should know the truth of the origins of this virus. So for me personally, let me just tell the story of my own kind of journey. When I first started looking into the lab leak hypothesis, what became terrifying to me and important to understand and obvious is the sort of like Sam Harris way of thinking, which is it's obvious that a lab leak of a deadly virus will eventually happen. My mind was, it doesn't even matter if it happened in this case. It's obvious that it's going to happen in the future. So why the hell are we not freaking out about this? And COVID-19 is not even that deadly relative to the possible future viruses. It's the way, I disagree with Sam on this, but he thinks about this way about AGI as well, about artificial intelligence. It's a different discussion, I think, but with viruses, it seems like something that could happen on the scale of years, maybe a few decades. AGI is a little bit farther out for me, but the terrifying thing, it seemed obvious that this will happen very soon for a much deadlier virus as we get better and better at both engineering viruses and doing this kind of evolutionary driven research, gain of function research. Okay, but then you started speaking out about this as well, but also started to say, no, we should hurry up and figure out the origins now, because it will help us figure out how to actually respond to this particular virus, how to treat this particular virus, what is in terms of vaccines, in terms of antiviral drugs, in terms of just all the number of responses we should have. Okay, I still am much more freaking out about the future. Maybe you can break that apart a little bit. Which are you most focused on now? Which are you most freaking out about now in terms of the importance of figuring out the origins of this virus?
I am most freaking out about both of them because they're both really important, and we can put bounds on this. Let me say first that this is a perfect test case for the theory of close calls, because as much as COVID is a disaster, it is also a close call from which we can learn much. Yeah. You are absolutely right. If we keep playing this game in the lab, especially if we do it under pressure, and when we are told that a virus is going to leap from nature any day, and that the more we know, the better we'll be able to fight it, we're going to create the disaster all the sooner. So yes, that should be an absolute focus. The fact that there were people saying that this was dangerous back in 2015 ought to tell us something. The fact that the system bypassed a ban and offshored the work to China ought to tell us this is not a Chinese failure. This is a failure of something larger and harder to see. But I also think that there's a clock ticking with respect to SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, the disease that it creates. And that has to do with whether or not we are stuck with it permanently. So if you think about the cost to humanity of being stuck with influenza, it's an immense cost year after year. And we just stop thinking about it because it's there. Some years you get the flu, most years you don't. Maybe you get the vaccine to prevent it. Maybe the vaccine isn't particularly well targeted. But imagine just simply doubling that cost. Imagine we get stuck with SARS-CoV-2 and its descendants going forward, and that it just settles in and becomes a fact of modern human life. That would be a disaster, right? The number of people we will ultimately lose is incalculable. The amount of suffering that will be caused is incalculable. The loss of well-being and wealth, incalculable. So that ought to be a very high priority, driving this extinct before it becomes permanent. And the ability to drive it extinct goes down the longer we delay effective responses. To the extent that we let it have this very large canvas, large numbers of people who have the disease in which mutation and selection can result in adaptation that we will not be able to counter, the greater its ability to figure out features of our immune system and use them to its advantage. So I'm feeling the pressure of driving it extinct. I believe we could have driven it extinct 6 months ago, and we didn't do it because of very mundane concerns among a small number of people. And I'm not alleging that they were brazen about or that they were callous about deaths that would be caused. I have the sense that they were working from a kind of autopilot in which you know, let's say you're in some kind of a corporation, a pharmaceutical corporation, you have a portfolio of therapies that in the context of a pandemic might be very lucrative. Those therapies have competitors. You, of course, want to position your product so that it succeeds and the competitors don't. And lo and behold, at some point, through means that I think those of us on the outside can't really intuit, you end up saying things about competing therapies that work better and much more safely than the ones you're selling that aren't true and do cause people to die in large numbers. But it's some kind of autopilot. At least part of it is.
So there's a complicated coupling of the autopilot of institutions, companies, governments, and then there's also the geopolitical game theory thing going on where you want to keep secrets. It's the Chernobyl thing where if you messed up, there's a big incentive, I think, to hide the fact that you messed up. So how do we fix this? And what's more important to fix? The autopilot, which is the response that we often criticize about our institutions, especially the leaders in those institutions, Anthony Fauci and so on, some of the members of the scientific community. And the second part is the game with China of hiding the information in terms of on the fight between nations.
Well, in our live streams on DarkHorse, Heather and I have been talking from the beginning about the fact that although, yes, what happens began in China, it very much looks like a failure of the international scientific community. And that's frightening, but it's also hopeful in the sense that actually if we did the right thing now, we're not navigating a puzzle about Chinese responsibility. We're navigating a question of collective responsibility for something that has been terribly costly to all of us. So that's not a very happy process. But as you point out, what's at stake is in large measure, at the very least, the strong possibility this will happen again, and that at some point it will be far worse. So, just as a person that does not learn the lessons of their own errors doesn't get smarter and they remain in danger, we collectively, humanity, has to say, well, there sure is a lot of evidence that suggests that this is a self-inflicted wound. When you have done something that has caused a massive self-inflicted wound, it makes sense to dwell on it exactly to the point that you have learned the lesson that makes it very, very unlikely that something similar will happen again.
I think this is a good place to kind of ask you to do almost like a thought experiment, or to steelman the argument against the lab leak hypothesis. So if you were to argue, you said 95% chance that the virus leaked from a lab. There's a bunch of ways I think you can argue that even talking about it is bad for the world. So if I just to put something on the table, is to say that, so one, it would be racism versus Chinese people. That talking about that it leaked from a lab, there's a kind of immediate kind of blame, and it can spiral down into this idea that's somehow the people are responsible for the virus and this kind of thing. Is it possible for you to come up with other steelman arguments against talking or against the possibility of the lab leak hypothesis?
Well, so I think steel manning is a tool that is extremely valuable, but it's also possible to abuse it. I think that you can only steel man a good faith argument. And the problem is we now know that we have not been engaged in opponents who were wielding good faith arguments, because privately their emails reflect their own doubts. And what they were doing publicly was actually a punishment, a public punishment for those of us who spoke up, with, I think, the purpose of either backing us down or, more likely, warning others not to engage in the same kind of behavior. And obviously for people like you and me who regard science as our likely best hope for navigating difficult waters, shutting down people who are using those tools honorably is itself dishonorable. So I don't feel that there's anything to steelman. And I also think that, immediately at the point that the world suddenly, with no new evidence on the table, switched gears with respect to the lab leak, at the point that Nicholas Wade had published his article, and suddenly the world was going to admit that this was at least a possibility, if not a likelihood, we got to see something of the rationalization process that had taken place inside the institutional world. And it very definitely involved the claim that what was being avoided was the targeting of Chinese scientists. And my point would be, I don't want to see the targeting of anyone. I don't want to see racism of any kind. On the other hand, once you create license to lie in order to protect individuals when the world has a stake in knowing what happened, then it is inevitable that that process, that license to lie, will be used by the thing that captures institutions for its own purposes. So my sense is it may be very unfortunate if the story of what happened here can be used against Chinese people. That would be very unfortunate. And as I think I mentioned, Heather and I have taken great pains to point out that this doesn't look like a Chinese failure. It looks like a failure of the international scientific community. So I think it is important to broadcast that message along with the analysis of the evidence. But no matter what happened, we have a right to know. And I frankly do not take the institutional layer at its word that its motivations are honorable and that it was protecting, good-hearted scientists at the expense of the world. That explanation does not add up.
Well, this is a very interesting question about whether it's ever okay to lie at the institutional layer to protect the populace. I think both you and I are probably have the same sense that it's a slippery slope. Even if it's an effective mechanism in the short term, in the long term, it's going to be destructive. This happened with masks. This happened with other things. If you look at just history of pandemics, there's an idea that panic is destructive amongst the populace. So you want to construct a narrative, whether it's a lie or not, to minimize panic. But you're suggesting that almost in all cases, and I think that was the lesson from the pandemic in the early 20th century, that lying creates distrust, and distrust in the institutions is ultimately destructive. That's your sense, that lying is not okay?
Well, okay. There are obviously places where complete transparency is not a good idea, right? To the extent that you broadcast a technology that allows one individual to hold the world hostage, right? Obviously, you've got something to be navigated. But in general, I don't believe that the scientific system should be lying to us. In the case of this particular lie, the idea that the well-being of Chinese scientists outweighs the well-being of the world is preposterous.
Yeah.
Right? As you point out, one thing that rests on this question is whether we continue to do this kind of research going forward. And the scientists in question, all of them, American, Chinese, all of them, were pushing the idea that the risk of a zoonotic spillover event causing a major and highly destructive pandemic was so great that we had to risk this. Now, if they themselves have caused it, and if they are wrong, as I believe they are, about the likelihood of a major world pandemic spilling out of nature in the way that they wrote into their grant applications, then the danger is, the call is coming from inside the house. And we have to look at that. And yes, whatever we have to do to protect scientists from retribution, we should do. But we cannot, protecting them by lying to the world, and even worse, by demonizing people like me, like Josh Rogan, like Yuri Dagan, the entire Drastic group on Twitter, by demonizing us for simply following the evidence, is to set a terrible precedent. Right? You're demonizing people for using the scientific method to evaluate evidence that is available to us in the world. What a terrible crime it is to teach that lesson, right? Thou shalt not use scientific tools? No, I'm sorry. Whatever your license to lie is, it doesn't extend to that.
Yeah, I've seen the attacks on you, the pressure on you has a very important effect on thousands of world-class biologists, actually. So at MIT, colleagues of mine, people I know, there's a slight pressure to not be allowed to, one, speak publicly, and two, actually think. Like, to even think about these ideas. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but just to, in the privacy of your own home, to read things, to think. It's many people, many world-class biologists that I know will just avoid looking at the data. There's not even that many people that are publicly opposing gain-of-function research. They're also like, it's not worth it. It's not worth the battle. And there's many people that kind of argue that those battles should be fought in private, with colleagues, in the privacy of the scientific community, that the public is somehow not maybe intelligent enough to be able to deal with the complexities of this kind of discussion. I don't know, but the final result is, combined with the bullying of you and all the different pressures in the academic institutions, is that it's just people are self-censoring and silencing themselves, and silencing the most important thing, which is the power of their brains. Like, these people are brilliant, and the fact that they're not utilizing their brain to come up with solutions outside of the conformist line of thinking is tragic.
Well, it is. I also think that we have to look at it and understand it for what it is. For one thing, it's kind of a cryptic totalitarianism. Somehow, people's sense of what they're allowed to think about, talk about, discuss is causing them to self-censor. And I can tell you it's causing many of them to rationalize, which is even worse. They're blinding themselves to what they can see. But it is also the case, I believe, that what you're describing about what people said, and a great many people understood that the lab leak hypothesis could not be taken off the table. but they didn't say so publicly. And I think that their discussions with each other about why they did not say what they understood, that's what capture sounds like on the inside. I don't know exactly what force captured the institutions. I don't think anybody knows for sure out here in public. I don't even know that it wasn't just simply a process. But you have these institutions. They are behaving towards a kind of somatic obligation. They have lost sight of what they were built to accomplish. And on the inside, the way they avoid going back to their original mission is to say things to themselves like, the public can't have this discussion. It can't be trusted with it. Yes, we need to be able to talk about this, but it has to be private. Whatever it is they say to themselves, that is what capture sounds like on the inside. It's a institutional rationalization mechanism, and it's very, very deadly. And at the point you go from lab leak to repurposed drugs, you can see that it's very deadly in a very direct way.
Yeah, I see this in my field with things like autonomous weapon systems. People in AI do not talk about the use of AI in weapon systems. They kind of avoid the idea that AI is used in the military. It's kind of funny. There's this like kind of discomfort, and they're like, they all hurry like like something scary happens and a bunch of sheep kind of like run away. That's what it looks like. And I don't even know what to do about it, and then I feel this natural pull every time I bring up autonomous weapon systems to go along with the sheep. There's a natural kind of pull towards that direction, because it's like, what can I do as one person? Now, there's currently nothing destructive happening with autonomous weapon systems. So we're in the early days of this race that in 10, 20 years might become a real problem. Now, the discussion we're having now, we're now facing the result of that in the space of viruses. For many years, avoiding the conversations here. I don't know what to do that in the early days. But I think we have to, create institutions where people can stand out. People can stand out and basically be individual thinkers and break out into all kinds of spaces of ideas that allow us to think freely, freedom of thought. And maybe that requires the decentralization of institutions.
Well, years ago, I came up with a concept called cultivated insecurity. And the idea is, let's just take the example of the average Joe, right? The average Joe has a job somewhere, and their mortgage, their medical insurance, their retirement, their connection with the economy is to one degree or another dependent on their relationship with the employer. That means that there is a strong incentive, especially in any industry where it's not easy to move from one employer to the next. There's a strong incentive to stay in your employer's good graces, right? So it creates a very top-down dynamic, not only in terms of who gets to tell other people what to do, but it really comes down to who gets to tell other people how to think. So that's extremely dangerous. The way out of it is to cultivate security. To the extent that somebody is in a position to go against the grain and have it not be a catastrophe for their family and their ability to earn, you will see that behavior a lot more. So I would argue that some of what you're talking about is just a simple, predictable consequence of the concentration of the sources of well-being, and that this is a solvable problem.